Welcome to Leaders Recon, where we'll be discussing leadership, warrior skills, and other unique opportunities within the G3 Leader Development branch. Today we'll be discussing great power competition and strategic planning with Colonel Dziengeleski. Colonel Dziengeleski, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So for those in our audience who don't know that much about your past experience, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a Virginia Guardsman. I'm an armor officer. I was commissioned in 1996 as an armor officer, served in the California Guard, West Virginia Guard, and Virginia Guard. Been a Title 10 AGR since 2000, so been in the program for quite a while. Started off as a functional Area 50 force manager, did that for about 6 years, and then went into the training division, was a training strategist, kind of like the strategy world. Applied for the School of Advanced Military Studies in 2008 when I was at Command and General Staff College, was accepted, and then graduated from there in 2009, and I've been a planner ever since. So it's been a rewarding career. It's been not your normal National Guard career, but I think that's part of the beauty of being in the National Guard compared to the regular Army, is that it's not as lockstep in career paths.
So what was it that initially made you want to join the military?
I'd love to tell you that it was kind of God and country, but what happened was that my father was laid off of work when I was in college, and a friend of mine who I played basketball with in college on our college team was in ROTC, and he said, "Hey, why don't you think about going into ROTC? There's scholarships available." And said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" So, talked with my dad, and every generation of my family has served in the military since we came over from Eastern Europe in the early 1900s. So just kind of worked its way out, and I got a scholarship, and the Army's had an officer for 24 years now. So
looking at strategic planning, as we're kind of diving into this, when I hear the term strategy or strategist or strategic planning, it sounds interesting, but actually putting my finger on what that is, can you kind of dive into what does a strategic planner do within DoD?
Sure, yeah. I think at a very fundamental level, we bring order out of chaos. We're usually at higher level of commands, usually at the 2 to 4 star level of command, and everything's very ambiguous. So as a strategist or a planner, you have to develop strategies and plans that provide order to the operational environment around us. So there's really 2 kinds of planning. There's institutional planning, which is what the services do in terms of how do we build a budget, how do we modernize, how do we build weapon systems, how do we develop doctrine. And then you have operational planning, which is really done at the combatant command and Army service component command level, which is, okay, the Army has built an army, so how do I utilize it operationally in a certain part of the world for a certain mission? So that's what we do. We build plans, we develop strategies, whether it's institutionally or operationally, depends on your assignment. But what we look for in our career field is to have kind of a career path where you veer in and out of both worlds. So by the time you reach the colonel rank, you're familiar with both.
You kind of talked about the different levels there a little bit. Can you dive into at what point in career should someone, if they're interested in getting involved with that, should they start looking into things? And then what's the best method to go about doing that?
So I would recommend, probably because it's an officer only career path, right? Unfortunately, there aren't paths for warrant officers or enlisted to become a strategist. What I would look at is probably post company command to start thinking about it, because you're right on the cusp of getting promoted to major. The field grade level is where you start getting into the ambiguous environments. When you're a company commander, you're always nested within a battalion, which is nested within a brigade, which is nested within a division. So if you want to become a functional Area 59 strategist or an operational planner or a SAMS grad, it's a much different level of thinking. You're out of the tactical world, the application of fire and maneuver. You still have to know that, still very important to know that, but it's just a different level of thinking. So I think probably the senior captain, early major, in the early part of your career as a major, start looking at whether you want to stay within your basic branch, and that's what SAMS allows you to do. So I'm still an armor officer, but if you want to go into a career field, that's where you leave your operational field, your basic branch, and you get a functional area, and that's how you become a functional area 59.
Do you think that your experience then as an armor officer, I'm guessing you were an armor company commander,
Yep.
How did that play a role into when you went on to SAMS and later on?
Well, SAMS is almost strictly focused on operational level planning. So what does that mean? Traditionally, that's been, your theater army and your core level, where you're taking strategies and you're trying to operationalize it so the tactical units can execute it. Okay. So if you don't have an understanding of tactics at the battalion and brigade level, you can't really build an operational plan for a division or for a corps, right? So I was an infantry division G5, 29th Infantry Division out of Virginia. We went to Afghanistan. So you have to understand the tactical being the lowest level, but you also have to understand the strategic, and you have to understand how they mesh. And that's your job as an operational planner, is to develop those operational plans that consist of the tactical execution and the strategic policy and goals.
Kind of talk about the Guard specifically. What are the opportunities for strategists or people looking at that career field, both on the Title 10 side, but is there on the Title 32 side as well?
Yeah, there is. Each state Joint Force headquarters has a 59 position. I think it's a lieutenant colonel billet in their J5. And then the division headquarters, so the Army National Guard division headquarters, they have, I believe, 5 SAMS grads and 1 strategist billet. So if you're in a state that has a division headquarters, you can certainly go that route. In terms of the Title 10 program, we have a much greater requirement for strategists between the Army Guard staff, the National Guard Joint Staff, and then really across the Title 10 AGR program, whether it's on the headquarters department of the Army staff, the big Joint Staff, Secretary of Defense's staff, or even the combatant commands. We have 59 CODA positions there. SAMS, a little bit different. One of our issues in the Guard right now is that we just don't have the throughput through both schoolhouses. So we're kind of interchangeable. So the active Army is a little bit different. They look at utilizing their strategists a little bit differently than their SAMS grads, but because we're the Guard and we just don't have the mass of personnel that have either one of the schooling requirements or the educational requirements, we kind of get treated the same way.
What would you say, from your experience so far, has been like the most rewarding or unique experience that you've had working as a strategist or a planner?
That's a tough question. There's probably been 2. The first one was I was the lead planner for the first drawdown in Afghanistan in 2011 at the corps level. And basically what happened was General Petraeus was the ISAF commander, and he said, look, the Corps has 75,000 personnel under it. The Corps has to develop the plan, and then everybody else will just fall in around it. Well, I guess some general officer liked me and said, hey, I want you to do this job. And that was very rewarding. It was very frustrating because we didn't get much guidance because the president, he was the determiner. I mean, he literally went up to West Point and had a press conference and said, here are your conditions. You're going to reduce by 10,000 by December of 2011, and then the next 20,000 are going to be in 2012. So that was frustrating, but it was interesting because you're kind of part of history, right? You're doing something that's going to be remembered in the historical record, which is just fascinating. And then the second job I had, which was fascinating, was working in the War Plans Division and then the J5 and the Big Joint Staff. And I was the PACOM and TRANSCOM planner there for 2 years, and then I was the Global Posture Branch Chief. And what was fascinating about that job was just the exposure you get. I had to brief the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, a number of times. I briefed Congress 5 times. Where I had to go over to the Rayburn building and talk with congressional staff members. And then I actually had to build 2 briefs for 2 different presidents. So I didn't brief the presidents. There were general officers doing that, but I was the one building the brief. So that was pretty fascinating as well. So just those 2 assignments, you wouldn't think, somebody from the National Guard would be offered those opportunities. Well, I'm telling you, it happens. And it happened to me, and it can happen to anybody else who comes in this career field. So It's fascinating. It really is. It's like I never expected to have a career like this, and the opportunities that have been given to me have been just flat out amazing.
So kind of shifting gears a little bit,
Mhm.
you touched on some of those unique experiences you were in. As we're shifting the focus here and talking about multi-domain operations
Mhm.
and this kind of competition phase
Sure.
with I guess China specifically, we know the national defense strategy kind of focuses on that great power competition. What does that look like today?
Well, like everything, it depends. I think from an Army perspective, a lot of the multi domain operations doctrine is really rooted in air land battle, which was developed in the 80s, the deep battle aspect of using deep fires, deep aviation attacks. The difference today is you have cyber, you have electronic warfare to a much greater extent than we had in the past, and then you have space. So if you add those three capabilities into the mix, it makes it more complicated, more complex, more difficult because of our reliance on digital communication systems, to pass along digital graphics or just for simple voice communications. What happens when, you have an electronic warfare attack on your unit and it burns your communication system out and now you can't communicate? It really is a challenging environment, and the Russians specifically have invested a great deal of money. They always have in electronic warfare, but now they're doing it to an even greater extent. So what they've done in the Ukraine and Crimea, shutting down communications and then using special forces and precision guided munitions with their artillery and aircraft is really a bit of a change from what we've been used to. Because look, the last 20 years, what have we been focused on? We've been focused on, counterinsurgencies, non-state actors, where you don't have to worry about large-scale units. You don't have to worry about, the Al Qaeda tank division, right? You're worried about two or three guys with an RPG or an IED detonating. It's a very tactical fight, and that's the difference I think that we have to progress to. Is we're really going, in a way, back to the future, where we're getting back to their focus is going to go back to brigade, division, corps level operations. And those are skills that have atrophied in the Army because we simply haven't had the requirement to do them because our focus has been elsewhere.
Kind of touching on that, what do you see then as, from your perspective, as like one of the greater emerging threats in the world today? And as a second part to that, we're recording this during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Has the pandemic changed that dynamic at all?
I went through a little bit of an knuckleball here. I think the greatest threat to our nation right now is our national debt, and I don't say that because I don't say that lightly. Number one, and it's not a new idea. I've heard when I was on the Joint Staff, General Dempsey had said that, and General Dunford had said that. And so, how COVID has made that even more problematic is that we've spent $4.5–5 trillion over the last 2 months during this pandemic. There's a result of that, which is that the national debt is going to increase. And so, but what does that have to do with the military? You may have to ask. Well, DoD has the largest discretionary budget within our nation. So if anything gets cut to pay for all this money that we borrowed, DoD is the most likely source of where you're going to see cuts. So from that perspective, national debt is your number one problem, because at a certain point in time, your interest payments are going to eclipse, and that time is very close, by the way. Your interest payments are going to eclipse your entire DoD budget. Okay, so when you get into an adversarial approach, who are our adversaries and who we need to be focused on? Obviously, China. China has been expansionist for the last 10 to 15 years. They've created artificial islands in the South China Sea and militarized them, putting aircraft on them, airfields on them, air defense assets. They now have carriers, and they're looking to build a full blue water navy. And they have the Silk Road Initiative, which is basically expanding their reach economically. And the thing about the Chinese is they expand economically and then they follow militarily. So South Sudan, they get 50,000 barrels of oil a day out of South Sudan. Now they have 2 battalions worth of Chinese peacekeepers in South Sudan. So it's very interesting from that perspective of what the Chinese are looking to do, because they have 1.3 billion people. They have to ensure that resources, whether it's food, oil, natural gas, what have you, it has to flow back into China, because if it doesn't, then you got a real problem. And the problem with it is the Chinese are a very orderly society based on Confucianism. And so the most important thing is to have order in their society. And if their people aren't happy because they don't have access to food, heat, potable water, that sort of thing, then you have a real problem. I think what you're going to see is this continual tension and friction between the United States and China all over the world for a number of different reasons. And the whole COVID-19 crisis hasn't helped because it came out of China. Don't know how it came out of China, whether it was at a wet market or somewhere else. Don't know, but it certainly hasn't helped matters, and it hasn't helped relations between the two countries. One of the strategic displays of power, because that's what you're really talking about, is the Navy. They call it freedom of navigation operations. So they'll take a carrier task force and they'll run it through between China and Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits. The Air Force likes to take bombers like that, and then they have a stack of bombers, either it's at Guam or it's somewhere in the United States, and you just see B-52 after B-52 after B-52 after B-52, and then they fly them over somewhere, and it's a show of force to say, hey, look, we understand what you're doing, we're not happy about it, and here's our response, and we're just warning you that we know what you're doing, and we're not happy about it, and we really don't want this to go any further, so please stop what you're doing. And so those are some of the strategic cards that are played to deter, because that's what it's all about, right, is deterrence. Okay, so we want to deter our adversaries from conducting certain actions, right? We would have liked to have deterred the Chinese from building all these artificial islands in the South China Sea and then militarizing them. Well, we failed. Why did we fail? Because we were so focused on the counter-ISIS, counter-Al-Qaeda fight that it just wasn't visible, and if it was visible, no one cared about it. So there's all these strategic choices that have to be made, but the bottom line is that we're always looking to deter people from, not people, we're looking to deter nations and their governments from disrupting the strategic environment in a way that's not beneficial to us.
Looking at DoD specifically, what are what from your perspective, what are some of those things that DoD can do to match that, some of those emerging threats? I know the debt's a little bit of a separate subject, but
right. Well, I mean, you have to take a look at what let's talk about the Army specifically, right? The Chinese Army traditionally has not been an expeditionary army. I mean, the last time the Chinese fought a war was in 1977 against the Vietnamese, and they got their nose bloodied quite badly by the Vietnamese army. I think they lost 40,000 dead and wounded in 3 months. So the issue is if the Chinese are going to build an expeditionary army, then it has to have things around it that are expeditionary. So it has to have expeditionary aircraft to be able to do airdrops and be air transportable. It has to have the sea lift, and that's what we're seeing out of China. That's exactly what they're doing. So where is that going to be applied? Well, if it's going to be applied in the Pacific, that is a very different fight than what we're used to in the Army, because you don't have large land masses, and you don't need large tank fleets. What you probably need is a lot of artillery, a lot of air defense, and the ability to actually use precision munitions, which means you have to keep your communications network viable. So it's going to be a much different kind. If we were to go to war with China, which I don't think is very likely for a whole slew of reasons, but if you were going to do it, that's where I think people are focusing at. The senior leadership is focusing in the Pacific, and the nature of the warfare in that region will be much different than large-scale ground combat, such as 3rd Infantry Division attacking into Baghdad during OIF-1. It's not going to be that kind of fight.
Obviously, there's a lot of complexities. Can you talk a little bit about what it looks like when you're talking about large-scale ground combat and developing plans for that in multi-domain operations?
Well, again, I think the key is to understand your enablers, right? The actual fighting force has to be protected. It has to have the logistics tail. I mean, that's one of the things that we learned in SAM's going through, is you actually build your scheme of support first, and then you build your scheme of maneuver. Because if you don't know what your logistics tail is, and you don't know how much fuel you require, or how many how many tank rounds that you need, or how many artillery rounds you need, if you don't have that in place, then it's very difficult to build a scheme of maneuver. The complexity of multi-domain operations, I think, and again, I'm a little bit hesitant to talk about it because it's so embryonic. It hasn't really been flushed out. I mean, the Army's only experimented with this stuff for maybe a year or two now, and I don't think we have a real good handle. But we have multi-domain task forces that are standing up in the active component. I think there's one out in the Pacific right now. It's either in Hawaii or Fort Bliss. I don't know where, but they're looking at how do you create the capability for a unit to operate in a contested environment. And what they mean by that is it's going to be contested politically, it's going to be contested economically, it's going to be contested with your communication systems. What happens if you don't have any satellites that are working? And so there's really more we don't know now than what we're going to know. Then you have COVID hit, and then it delays everything because we're kind of waiting for this to pass.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of curious about, was that as we dive into everything being more interconnected and it becomes more of a national security enterprise instead of just DoD focused, like if how that shifts, objectives within the United States military specifically.
Well, I mean, we don't know. Yeah, it's a hard question to ask. It's like a blind man walking into a dark room. You just don't know what's in the room. You're kind of fumbling around right now, and that's why you have to stand up task forces and experimental units to kind of understand your new capabilities, right? They're looking at there's an extended range M777 cannon that they're working on that can shoot out tens of kilometers further. They're looking at other types of cannon systems. They're looking at direct energy weapons. So there's all sorts of different capabilities that they're looking to come online. That's the science, okay? Yeah. The art is, how do we use them? How do we train on them? How do we integrate them? And how do we develop a force that can fight under those conditions and people are comfortable with it and understand the limitations and the limitations of the new equipment when it comes online, and then also the capabilities, what makes it different than what we have today. And so we're still kind of feeling that out right now.
So kind of diving back into your experience then, having looked at a lot of this stuff at the strategic level, what's your advice either from lessons learned from getting your hands dirty in this, or your advice to National Guard leaders out there who are trying to kind of shape some of their units training and stuff focused to be more towards this large-scale ground combat? And
well, I think there's a number of things. I mean, the first thing is you have to experiment, okay? And with experimentation is you have to let people fail, okay? And as long as it's not a failure, a deliberate failure where somebody's trying to mess up on purpose, you have to be tolerant enough to understand that, hey, you're kind of operating in a new environment where we haven't operated for quite a while. So there's going to be hiccups, right? So that's the first thing. Have an acceptance of failure, correct it, move on, get better. The second thing is, I think is critical, is mentorship. The people who were like me, who were commissioned in the mid-90s, we were really the tail end of the air-land battle. Like when I went to my officer basic course at Fort Knox in 1997, we were still understanding battlefield calculus and understanding the echelonment of then Russian, but literally Soviet forces and how they echelon their forces. So we're going to have to get back into that, and it's not going to be a very smooth process because we've just lost a lot of that knowledge over time. As I said, the people who are either commissioned or joined the Army, enlisted in the Army in the 90s, are really probably the last people that have the experience. So it's going to be a pretty steep learning curve.
So talking about the National Guard specifically here, when we're looking at the operational use of the National Guard forces in large-scale ground combat, can you, obviously a lot longer time for us to spin up than some of the active duty components. How does that work when you're looking at National Guard utilization in the case of large-scale war?
Well, that's a risk assessment, right? Depends. It depends. So if you have a scenario like on the Korean Peninsula where it's literally the only fight tonight scenario, There may be things that are required for DoD and the Army to accept to say, hey, look, we have to get National Guard forces into the mix earlier, and we'll assume some risk with them not being trained up to full standard. Maybe get trained up to the 85% standard instead of the full 100% standard. I'm not saying that's going to happen, just an example. The difference between the Army of today and the Army of the late 1980s is that the active Army is only 500,000 people, right? So we are fully integrated within all the plans and all the what's called a TIPFID, which is your deployment, orders. So we're going to be used. It's just a matter of how quickly we get there. And then again, outside of the Korea scenario, I think we're going to have a lot more time than we think. I really do.
So you had talked earlier a little bit about kind of talking about DIME and the national security enterprise as a whole. I was meeting with the State Department the other day, and they were talking about the state partnership program.
Sure.
And how from their, like, everyone at the State Department knew about the state partnership program, which I feel like is unique because a lot of places you go, they don't, Yep. What do you think the role is that from, as a strategist perspective, having the state partners across the country, across the world, how does that look?
I think it's a great asset, not just for the National Guard, but for the nation as a whole. And the reason why is if you take a look at, great power competition, one of the struggles that the U.S. military has had with great power competition is we're not designed for it. Okay, the difference is that in Russia or China or Iran or North Korea, any country that's ruled by an autocrat, there aren't the separations of powers within their government, which means they can use their military in different ways than we can. We're limited by law and by policy on how you can utilize the military. State partnership program, I think, is an invaluable tool for great power competition because it develops alliances, it develops training opportunities, professional military education opportunities. And I'll give you a perfect example. So when I was deployed to Afghanistan the last time, the Poles and the Illinois National Guard have a very close state partnership program relationship. How does that relate into, battlefield power? Well, the Poles deployed a brigade of infantry called Task Force White Eagle every year, and they had anywhere between 30 and 50 Illinois Guardsmen that were advisors within the Polish brigade. So why does that matter? It matters because that's one less American brigade that can be used in a fight. Yeah, we send some people over, but it's really it's multiplying our battlefield combat power by forming these alliances. And that's just with a combat focus. If you go back into the great power competition sphere, is the friendships and the relationships that are made. There's a sense of mutual, shared understanding. There's a shared sense of who the adversary is. There's a shared sense of hardship, and so that develops over time and becomes very, very critical as we know more people within other nations' militaries who rise up in power and stature within their military. It allows us access that we normally wouldn't have. Okay, so I think it's a superb vehicle for the National Guard, and I'm not surprised that the State Department thinks highly of it. I mean, if you talk to most people within DoD or the State Department or the interagency, they see the value in it. They really do.
Kind of shifting gears back again, if we're talking to that first line leader on the officer side, like whether that's your platoon leader, even your platoon sergeant, right, or your company commander, first sergeant, like those people that are working at that tactical level, what is your advice to them for preparing for like modernization, some of those big changes that are occurring within our formations?
So a number of things, really. I mean, number one is mentorship. If you're a leader, you have to be a mentor. Well, you can't be a good leader and a good mentor if you're not mentored yourself. So finding a good mentor, and by the way, good mentors should be hard on you. They should be telling you what your limitations and things that you need to be better at. It's not just a happy to glad, hey, you're the best thing since canned beer. It just doesn't work that way. It's, as a mentor, I have to point out to people who I mentor is, hey, look, here are the things you're strong at. Here are the things you need to work on. Here's how you do that, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is just read, and when you're done reading, read some more, because you absolutely positively have to have an understanding of military history, of doctrine, of tactics. And if you don't have that, you really don't know your job. And that's what it comes down to. So the more you read about that sort of thing, the better educated you become, the more valuable you are to your chain of command. You have to keep flexibility of thought. Do not become dogmatic. When new information arises and the environment is changing, you have to adapt with the environment, right? So if you take those three things, I think that those will set you up for success when you come out of the tactical and the company grade level world and into the field grade and operational and strategic level. It's a solid foundation.
So, and you talked a little bit about reading there, just kind of tying up. We always ask some of these same questions to all of our guests, and that is like, what are some of the resources that really help develop you as a leader over the course of your career?
Having great mentors, people who were willing to challenge me. There were 2 or 3 that saw something in me that I didn't know I had, and would push me to get to where I'm at, whether that is was at a company grade level or a field grade level or as a lieutenant colonel. Actually, my boss right now, she mentors the heck out of me every day, whether I want it or not. So it's that's really important. But I just go back to reading. I really do. I mean, read your history. If I think a lot of people get confused about multi-domain operations. Well, they just broke open the 100-5 1986 version and looked at air-land battle and looked at what we have in writing on multi-domain operations. There wouldn't be that much of a difference, but we don't read history, and that's part of our problem. I've got 4 books that I would recommend. The first book is called A History of Western Military Thought by an Israeli historian called Azar Gat, G-A-T. And one bright officer who I mentor said that this was CGSC in one book, Command and General Staff College in one book. And what it does is it looks at how the philosophical underleanings of the Enlightenment all the way up to the current day influenced military thought, influenced tactics, influenced the way that we conduct warfare in the West. Okay, so that's invaluable. The second book, and this dovetails nicely into that, is called The Scientific Way of Warfare by a French-Canadian called Antoine Bousquet. And that looks at the industrial revolutions over time and how that's influenced warfare. So if you put those two together, you have a rock-solid foundation, and you will know more than 90% of the officers in the Army, because 90% of the officers haven't read those 2 books. The third book I would recommend is The Transformation of War by Martin van Creveld, another Israeli historian. And he wrote that in the early 90s. And what he said was, and I think it became very true on 9/11, was that, look, people fight for a whole lot of different reasons. They just don't fight for their country. They fight for their tribe. They fight for their religion. So what he calls it is non-Trinitarian warfare. What he's referring to is Clausewitz's Trinity of the Army, the people, and the state. It's outside of that. So that's why it's really important, because we spent the last 20 years fighting non-Trinitarian warfare opponents, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, those sorts of terrorist groups. And then finally, I think a book that is very interesting, it will probably make you angry when you read it, but that's part of being an intellectual, is to read things that you may not agree with, is a book called The 50-Year Wound. It's written by a guy named Derek Liebart, who's a professor at Georgetown. And what this book is an examination of America's Cold War decisions, both militarily and politically, and the cost of those decisions, and looking at them and saying, hey, were there better ways we could have gone and done this? And when you look at some of these things and the way that he frames his argument, again, you're probably going to be pretty angry, and then you're going to say, a lot of times this guy was absolutely right. But that's the beauty of reading. It's for the individual to take away the lessons of those books. So those are the 4 that I would start with.
Colonel Dziengeleski, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing some of your experiences. If you'd like more information related to anything we discussed here or other features, please click on our social media pages in the links below. Tune into Leaders Recon over the next few weeks as we bring in today's leaders and pioneers to discuss their experiences, share their wisdom, and help you grow as a leader. We will also be announcing opportunities for you to sharpen your skills as a leader in today's Army National Guard. See you next time. If you liked today's episode, don't forget to subscribe below and leave us a 5-star review. You can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.